Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Catherine Ann Porter channel. This is the third in a series of videos I hope to do where I discuss some aspect of Porter or maybe a Porter short story with a Porter scholar, and maybe a Porter biographer or just a writer like me that likes Catherine Ann Porter. So my special guest today is a poet who hails from Tennessee, and she has published, like me, she's published three books of poetry, and her latest book is called Between Gone and Everlasting. And I encourage anybody who's watching this to check it out at the library, buy it in the bookstore. It's definitely worth getting your hands on, as are her other two books. I've read a lot of her works, and highly highly recommend her, much more than I recommend my own work. So anyway, welcome, Danita Dodson. How are you?
I'm doing well, Alan. It's such a pleasure to be here with an esteemed fellow writer to discuss Catherine Ann Porter on Sunday afternoon.
Yes, perfect time. And well, thank you. And thank you for your time. So I guess we'll just dive right in. Today we'll be discussing Porter's great short story, The Jilting of Granny Weatherall. And I have to say, this is the very first story of Porter's that I read. It was for a high school class. I'll never forget it and the effect that it had on me. And it sort of got me into Porter, and I became a lifelong fan after that. Can you remember maybe the first time when you read this story?
Likewise, it was in high school.
Okay.
I turned around 4 or 5 short years after graduating college and was assigned a 11th grade English class. And lo and behold, it fell in my lap again in an anthology. So I've actually taught this story.
Oh, okay, great. And I have two actually for a summer school class for a community college. Yeah, I remember it so well because I think it was Porter's most frequently anthologized story back then. I'm not sure now, and it's in college. I think it's in college textbooks, or it was for a while. So I guess it's a good story to talk about. It's been endlessly analyzed. It's one of Porter's most discussed stories. So let's talk about the stream of consciousness technique, which this story employs. And I don't think Porter used this technique very often. I'm trying to think of another story where she utilized it from beginning to end. This might be the only story where she really did it from beginning to end. Maybe parts of Ship of Fools, you might say, or Stream of Consciousness. And it's a very sort of modern Faulknerian, if that's a word, Faulknerian technique. And let's be honest, Porter is no Faulkner, and at least not in this area. I'm sure Faulkner took stream of consciousness to heights that no one else could have attained. He was so brilliant at it. But I wanted to ask you, as far as just focusing on this story, do you think the stream of consciousness technique is utilized well? Does it sound authentic? Does it sound genuine? And is there any confusion at all?
Well, I've read a lot of modernist literature, and so she was up against a squad of, I guess, folks who had mastered the art of stream of consciousness. But as far as modernist literature, you've arrived if you can achieve that. In my opinion, it's very well crafted. I was moved again, having a long respite since I last read this story. But what was poignant for me is that as a reader, we're able to experience her memories, this interior dialogue in a nonlinear way. And I knew what was happening, having read this and taught the story. And so it's especially rereading it again, knowing that we are looking at the mental state of a dying woman. And we get flashbacks of her dying thoughts that blends this past and present, and that's not an easy thing to achieve. And I think her use of it enhances the emotional depth of the story, and we get this intimate portrayal of Granny and that rich character. I think psychologically rich, that allows us to see this funny, wry, smart, sassy woman that we
Sure.
may not have otherwise got to see if we had this omniscient narrator who described her on her deathbed and saw her as Cornelia saw her.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we get to see these quips and observations through her sporadic thought process that's largely unspoken because of her illness. And we also get to see what she might have been like in the past through those quips, the sharp, merciless, perhaps even times cruel person. What a tongue, I mean, she might have had if she'd been able to say everything that was in her mind. And in a few short pages, I think Porter just achieves brilliantly this colorful character that we can only see through this process. But it can be, the second part of your question, I think confusing for some readers who are not familiar
Mhm.
with the modernist movement and the stream of consciousness because it's so fragmented and
Sure.
it's rapid jump, between the past and present. But I think that disjointedness mirrors that inner turmoil and all that
Mhm.
unresolved feelings that, we don't move when we're dealing with pain and we're dealing with grief. And that last paragraph shows us that grief, and I've written about it in my latest book, um, doesn't happen in a linear way. So
Mhm.
that I think that enriches where she takes us in the denouement. But from the modernist standpoint, if I look at it as a modernist scholar, um, modernist writers make us piece together the meaning. So she gives us a little work to do, and I think in a brilliant way.
Mhm.
That's just my spin. I think she pulls it off well.
And it's great too because it's one of those stories where you might have to read it 2 or 3 times to fully understand what's going on, but those are the best kinds of stories, in my opinion, the ones you wanna read again. So I have to ask you though, because I think a lot of, readers are confused when she talks about Hapsy, and
Hmm.
that's might be where some confusion enters into the stream of consciousness because it's kind of, a little blurred. So who do you think Hapsy is?
I was rethinking about this last night because I am still confused, and and I'll admit it. I think that that's part of the beauty of leaving that open for that,
Uh,
that invention of meaning from the reader. She makes us work to fight to think of who Hapsy is. In many ways, I think, she is a younger daughter that, well, with a baby on her arm, I think I wonder if she has died in childbirth.
mhm,
Someone who had died before
mhm,
she met her prime. Could it be symbolic of parts of the youthful granny, Ellen Weatherall, when she
mhm,
was younger? I wonder. And then there's also that blur of who lost the child. It's Hapsy's time has come, but then at one point she talks about losing the only child she ever wanted. She lost.
mhm.
Whether that was Hapsy or the baby. So I'm still trying to work it out. I spent some more time with it last night, and I think um, maybe that's what she wanted for us to become involved in her life. What do you
Mhm.
think, Alan?
Well, I was gonna say, maybe stream of consciousness isn't meant to be fully understood. That's kind of the point of stream of consciousness, right? It's not we're in somebody else's brain, and some things are so personal to them that nobody else would ever understand. But I've read so many interpretations of the story. Some people think Hapsy is her daughter. Some people think it's her granddaughter, and as you say, or a daughter that died in childbirth. And I know at some point, doesn't she say, or she imagines her saying, "I thought you'd never come." I think that's for Hapsy. And I think I interpret that as, well, I thought you'd never come and join me in heaven because she's so old and she's taking so long to to die to get back to get to Hapsy in heaven. That's how I interpret that one line. So it's obviously somebody who's died with his. I guess it doesn't really matter if it's a daughter or a granddaughter or what, but someone that she'll be reunited with in heaven that she's taking a long time to get to. That's all
Right.
I have to say about it.
That's it. You spoke exactly my perception of those lines. I'm
Yeah.
thinking of another thing, having been exploring a lot of Appalachian mountain, the old women of that era, the granny women,
Mhm.
who were often nicknamed, were called grannies because they were helpers to go in. And she does talk about this, having this history of helping the sick and
Mhm.
the animals. So Hapsy could have even been someone that, she could have been a midwife. That's part of often the
Mhm.
work of granny. So
Sure, sure.
that I just thought of that last night again as I was reading, but whoever it was, Where was it a daughter or someone she encountered that she got close to, or was it
Hmm.
an element of herself? It's something that was dear to her.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's see. Let's talk about the kind of life that Granny Weatherall has had that's portrayed in this story. And you described her and used some great adjectives. You described her in the beginning, spry and humorous and maybe even cruel at times. How does her life or the life that she's had inform her attitudes, do you think?
Well, um, based upon what's revealed in her thoughts, and we're trusting her judgment for what's exposed to us. She's not had an easy life, and I think Porter wants us to see this, but that she's also a gritty survivor, and we have to
Mhm.
admire that, or I do.
Sure.
And she's prides herself on that strength that she's had, the mothering skills, ability to be a single mom, to run a household alone after John died, and become, in essence, the mother and father. And there's no evidence that she remarried, right? We don't hear
Right.
that. So
Right.
she did those traditionally feminine tasks that she takes pride on, about cooking and placing the hairbrushes in the right order and making clothes and gardening and taking care of the sick. But I love the line about, well, I could do the work of the man. I remember this
Mhm.
time when, and she's dying. She's remember this time that over 100, she dug post holes over a
Yes.
hundred acres of farmland. Um, so we must trust the storyteller who has named her, the narrator or the writer, the storyteller, Weatherall, which
Mhm.
is symbolic of all those difficulties that we see flash through her mind. And she can't conceive of ever giving up a fight.
Mhm.
And so the way she's lived informs the way she dies. Uh,
Mhm.
Even when she's gravely ill, she tells herself, "Oh, this too shall pass. I'll
Mhm.
be up to my old self in a couple of days." And so the self-identifies as a strong matriarch and is enraged that her children treat her like a child. And
Mhm.
I think that's especially poignant, if we spend any time with people who are aging, and the whole process of to for children to dote on their parents, to care for their well-being, um, but she doesn't see herself as someone who needs to be taken care of, and so she has created this life that's been hard, but the survivorship by repressing all those painful feelings, almost obsessively controlling, trying to
Mhm.
control
Mhm.
everything. But again, I think there's something admirable in that obstinance because I think it allows her to power on. But one thing that we see, I want to say to finish up answering this question, I was rethinking again, as I reread about this emphasis she has upon waste.
Mhm.
At the very end, and then all the evidence where uh, this fear of wasting things has informed her life, like food, even
Mhm.
the cake that was wasted at the
Mhm.
wedding that never got to happen.
Sure.
And so she turns to this unnamed person in the story and says, "Hey, you make sure that you pick all the fruit, nothing goes to waste, and don't squander life," which we have to wonder that because she lost her true love, maybe she's feeling that her life is a waste.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. And so many of Porter's stories, I don't know if you saw my interview with Beth Alvarez. We talked about Flowering Judas and how that story was, in a lot of ways, about self delusion. I think a lot of Porter's stories are about this, all the ways in which people delude themselves, and also self betrayal is in there too. So, in what way would you say that Granny Weatherall has deluded herself, if she has?
Um, I think she has in several ways. I think she's been in deep denial, even all those things that I mentioned that are admirable.
Mhm.
And we I think we have to look at the fact that she has deluded herself about some basic aspects of her life and character. Um, she refuses to believe she's dying.
Yes.
That's one thing at the very end. She refuses to believe that she never got over the man who jilted her
Yes.
at the altar, that she truly loved, her soulmate. She tells herself that she's had this wonderful life with John, forgotten George completely. And so that fixation we get to see on George in those last moments shows us clearly that she has not forgotten him. So
Sure.
we get to see that denial laid bare. But Granny also doesn't see that she has treated Cornelia um, harshly, or is in the moment. But we wonder what all has she said to her if she has these things. What has been her relationship to her children,
Hmm.
and has she admitted any shortcomings? Because in her mind, she's bragging on being able to be a mother and father. Um, and she won't concede that the confusion she's got right there in the moment is actually the result of her illness, and not the fault of everyone else. So she's, like, get away from me, doctor. What's the doctor's name? Um,
Dr. Harry, is it?
yeah,
Yeah.
right. He's, you're just still a young man or whatever. So she's finding people to blame other than herself. But it seems to me that Porter's showing us that this denial is both a necessity and a handicap. I'll look at
Hmm.
the handicap part first. Of course, she seems to acknowledge, self-acknowledge so little about herself. Um, and then we see that that denial probably has imposed some hardships upon people around her. And she won't even admit that she's possibly been hard on her children. So they don't even get this satisfaction of an apology, or sort of a closure of their relationship together on earth. At the same time, this denial it's what's let her go on,
Hmm.
She's just, she's been able to avoid being permanently brokenhearted throughout life. And she just managed to soldier through life and do things for people, to care for people, if we trust what she's telling us in her um, dying thoughts, that she has been there for people.
A
So
survival mechanism, no doubt. Absolutely. Um, let's talk about this, the last paragraph of the story. That's so, because reading the story, eventually she's got to die. And so
mm,
obviously in the last paragraph, she passes on. It's interesting when you really read that last paragraph and really know what happens. It's what she's expecting at death and how she dies that becomes so interesting, and may actually sort of contain maybe what the meaning of the story is all about. So what makes the last paragraph of the story, after everything you've read, so tragic?
um, it is so tragic. In fact, and I've read a lot of modernist short fiction. I think it's one of the most tragic,
Hmm.
uh, because of the irony that Porter, I think, and short fiction is driven by good use of irony.
Hmm.
And not all writers can use it so well. But is it, in the words of Alanis Morissette, isn't it ironic, don't you think,
Yeah.
that she's been jilted at the altar years ago by this true love, George, and as that's on her mind, um, she's she's not thinking about meeting the bridegroom so much as she just assumes that God or Jesus is going to be right there. This divine love, this divine presence is going to be there, and that ultimately that same she feels an abandonment that is even worse. That this sense of being jilted not only by human love, but by divine presence. And to me, that is heartbreaking. I mean, I cried again reading this, to look at the rawness. And then what's that sentence? I'll, she says she can not remember any sorrow because this grief wiped them
Wipe them
all
all away.
away.
Yeah.
It's like, forget you, George. I'm over that, where God's jilted me. Um, but another thing I think that Porter is showing us the power of epiphany, and she is a master of doing this in her stories, as
Hmm.
you've explored in other discussions. But what she does here is give us an epiphany, an aha moment where Granny, the lights come on, even though symbolically we have that fading process where the light's going out, that uh, there's a denial that is it's shattering because that denial has been in the background. And I was thinking of Shakespeare as I read the last sentence, that out down candle,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
the cinematic way that she portrays by the previous paragraph, where she has that lampshade and the blue light. And then I could just see some of those old movies, if they were portraying this, how that light just dwindles and then finally it's gone.
Hmm.
And then there's nothing, or there's this nihilism, which is
Hmm.
so shattering.
Hmm. And I guess God was supposed to be the reward for her of everything she had suffered in
Yeah.
life, including the jilting.
Yeah.
And then she's jilted again. So it's a real, when you look at it that way, it's a real downer of a story, and maybe very modern in that way. And I guess a story with an atheistic viewpoint, right?
Hmm.
And I was discussing Flowering Judas with Beth Alvarez. We talked about that last paragraph. It's kind of unusual, or which I felt kind of went off the rails. I like the story until the last last paragraph, but it's kind of unusual for Porter to inject religious symbolism into a story. Very unusual for her because she was not religious. I mean, she wasn't Flannery O'Connor, who I think was obsessed obsessed with religion. So a little unusual for her to do that. And so here we have in the last paragraph, once again, the bridegroom, I guess, who's compared to Christ, who doesn't appear, and that's the second jilting. And I guess if I had to criticize this story in any way, and it's hard to find fault with Porter, it really is, because she wrote perfect or nearly perfect stories, but I think the last paragraph might be a little too clever. The again, no bridegroom and the priest in the house. That's the only sort of little fault I would find with it. But it's certainly, and at the end, it seems like, and this is where I think the title is a little bit ironic. We talked about Granny Weatherall. The
Hmm.
title's a little ironic because she doesn't weather all. She doesn't weather what happens to her in the end. She
Hmm.
has to like cut it short. In fact, she blows out her own light and in essence kills herself because she can't take it. She can't weather that. She may have weathered the jilting, even though she never got over the humiliation of it, but she doesn't weather what happens to her at the end. So I guess I find that title a little bit ironic, at least as it applies to the last part of the story. So let's talk about the title, because the title's got several layers to it. How would you say the title of this story sums up the story?
Um, yeah, what's in the title? It's very, very important. Um, and even reading that, going into the story for the very first time, I guess we both remember in high school, um, reading it, and teachers telling us pay attention to the title. So we know someone is jilted. We know it's Granny Weatherall. So there's this inquiry of, how was she stood up, that kind of thing. We go into the story expecting that, and whoever this character is, for that to be exposed. I don't think we expect what we get to the end, but part of that irony is how she layers things, just through that word jilting, which encapsulates a theme, a central theme of story, which is very much in a modernist theme,
Mhm.
that rejection, that abandonment, that feeling of, being in a world where you feel you're, part of the lost generation discuss this too.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so this parallel, I think, that we see between what we finally get to hear is this lover, this fiance, George, that she hopes they never find the letters, I wonder
Mhm.
what all was in those steaming letters. Hope they never, I meant to get rid of those letters before my children found them. Um, we finally get to meet that George, and where you wonder if her children even knew about him, right?
Mhm.
But we get to see that, and we get to see then the fact that she keeps tracking those mentions of George, that the whole process of being jilted, that rawness of that relationship being shattered, uh, is still with her. But then that through that title and through that situation with George, um, Porter is able to give us the other jilting that you talked about, the jilting by Jesus, or
Mhm.
the Lord, um, where she is jilted by both human love and divine presence. And she's jilted herself, right? I think that's another play on the word. This whole denial, to go back what we talked about, by refusing to accept emotional pain and trauma. Of course, we'll hear more about, trauma studies and things in our own time. Um, but in that era, that's what people did. I know here in the Appalachian Mountains, that's what people did. They just powered on if
Mhm.
tragedy came. And so she just brushed away all that pain, and she jilted herself by not by emotionally, in many ways, emotionally distancing herself. Um,
Okay. So the Jilting of Granny Weatherall, whenever I see that title, I think of the second jilting more than I think of the first one. But that's just me. But obviously, it's referring to both. But it's sort of the second one that maybe that stays with you at the end of this when you finally finish the story, rather than the first one. So this brings me to the last question I'd like to ask is, because everybody's always trying to find the writer in the story, like how much of this story reflects like the writer's own attitudes, and they've done this with Porter as well, because we have a lot of Porter's letters that tell us what her attitudes were about a lot of things. But what would you say this story says about Porter's own attitudes, or does it say anything? Can you tell what Porter's own attitudes were toward life, toward love, and toward religion?
I feel you can, but maybe that's in retrospect, reading all those wonderful things that we have about her biography, and wanting to find the author, textual evidence of who she was. But she admitted herself, if I get this right, that did she once write, "I shall try to tell the truth, but the result will be fiction."
Yes, yes,
So, right, that
yes.
she admitted, I don't know if if she'd been asked in her time by people who read her story how much of you is in there, but she admitted that there are elements of herself, I think, just through that point. But it, it seems to me that there are all indications that this is Granny Weatherall is based upon her own grandmother, Catherine Ann Porter, from after whom she takes her name, right?
That's right.
Spelled with a K.
That's right.
Uh, and I think that's part of that memory, however she felt about this grandma, um, it still was still with her, and it was something that she wanted to write about. Um, And I think the story addresses religious, um, or thoughts, her own religious belief or lack thereof. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But and also grave illness. Porter had personal knowledge of the kind of things she makes Granny go through. She had a difficult life, like Granny. She grew up in poverty in this rural environment. Was it Texas, I think?
Yes, yes.
Um, and Granny talks about having pneumonia and milk leg or something, and Porter had TB, tuberculosis, and the
Hmm.
Spanish flu. She was a survivor of a pandemic.
Yeah.
She had two marriages, I think, right?
Oh no, many more than two. Yeah.
Many more than two?
Well, actually, I was interviewing Darlene Unruh in my first video, and she uncovered some hidden marriages in her biography that Joan Givner had not uncovered like 20 years earlier in hers. So
Oh,
I think it's four or five. I
oh,
think.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, she, like Granny, had these unresolved, I guess, experiences with relationships, that didn't last, right?
Yeah.
But she did have a marriage, if I'm remembering correctly, and this was her first to this. She had an abusive
Yes.
relationship with an alcoholic husband who
Mhm.
physically harmed her.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then she had, and I don't know if this was her last husband, but she had that man that was many years younger than her in a marriage that I
Hmm.
don't think uh, lasted too long. But in essence, I think she decides to go on alone, maybe not without men, but she realized that aloneness, which is a theme in this story,
Hmm.
uh, might be um, what she is dealt. But she gave herself the independence in real life and this colorful life that was denied to Granny. Uh, I am envious of all the things she did, other than in addition to writing these beautiful stories. Was she an actress? She went to Mexico
Hmm.
and was a journalist and a teacher there, and hung out with revolutionaries
Yep.
and the great painter Diego Rivera.
Hmm.
I mean, just to say one has had that life,
Hmm.
that's a movie in itself, or a story.
Hmm.
But I think because of this more expansive worldview, that's she starts thereafter abandoning her Catholicism, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Yes, and she came back to it, I think, later in life.
Later.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, that questioning process, that whole questioning of traditional religious beliefs, I think that we see a mirror of that in Granny's realization that now she's questioned who God is. God
Hmm.
is not here, that kind of thing. And then Porter, very important, I'm speaking as a woman too. Porter reflects on the conflict that she and many of her contemporaries experienced, that I wish for this uh, beautiful home life and a family and love versus this independent identity and personal autonomy. And Granny seems to take some pride in standing alone. She did all this without John. So I think Porter spoke for women, that we shouldn't miss that. And she does that in some of her other stories,
Hmm.
and especially those who experience those physical and psychological limitations because of gender and society. And she understood those personally. So I think it's right. And she was doing this in an era when not there weren't many who were,
Hmm.
or so that the caged bird can sing, right? Finally,
Hmm.
he's
Hmm.
free. One other thing I want to point out, and I'm interested in your perspectives because you're a scholar of Porter, about what you've inquired of me. But I also see this fragmentation of Granny's thoughts as a modernist commentary on a fragmented world.
Yes, definitely.
She once
Definitely.
said, you see that too.
Yes.
She once said that her mind and spirit had been spent in the effort to grasp the meaning of the threats of world catastrophe and
Hmm.
understand the logic of that terrible failure of humanity. And that seems like it's ripped from the headlines right now of our own time. So many
Hmm.
of us are trying to make sense of what's happening in our world. Um, and though the story, she has a lens that zooms into this rural, maybe Texas landscape.
Hmm.
I think that Porter pans out and shows us in many ways in 1930, right?
Hmm.
Kind of mirrors in the fatalism, the lost generation that people like Hemingway wrote about.
Hmm.
So I think it's what we see at the very ending is more than just a commentary on religion or belief in God, um, but as much as a commentary on a world that leaves us with this heavy sense of fatalism.
Hmm.
And maybe I'm reading it through the lens of now.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, that reminds me of T.S. Eliot too, who became a religious poet, himself. Yeah, I was thinking about trying to sum it up when I was thinking about this question last night. Porter's attitudes toward life, love, and religion. I think just just concentrating totally on this story and ignoring everything else that she ever said. Seems like she thinks that if we're to read something in her in the story, that she thinks life is something to be weathered. Love is a disappointment, and religion is a lie. If I
Right.
just sum it up very quickly, I would say that. Of course, it's probably a lot deeper than that. We can go into a much deeper discussion. But I have to sum it up in three sentences. That would be it. Which kind of leads me to I just thought of one more question to ask, and this might be the toughest question of all. It's a question I've asked myself because I've taught this story and I've taught a lot of short stories, and students I think have trouble when they read Porter sort of grasping, okay, what is this story about? Because our art is subtlety, and Porter is so subtle, I think too subtle sometimes, that it's hard to, like when you read Ship of Fools, she was frustrated because people didn't get to what the heart of the novel or the theme of the novel was. But that's hard to do in such sprawl, which the novel is. And then also reading some of her shows. So what would you say this particular story is about if you had to pinpoint a theme? I know it's a tough question, and I can't answer it either, but
It is a tough question. I Well, we talked about, the abandonment and the fragmentation of society, relationships. I still throw in all those things in as themes that I would emphasize and have emphasized teaching this story. But if I, I may wax a little didactic here, to say that if she is trying to show us some kind of truth about how to live well through a character, and lots of writers do. Uh, 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 what is this story teaching us about? Um, it is a tough question. I think to be honest with our pain is
Mhm.
one thing,
Sure, sure.
right? I think,
Well, that's where the self-delusion theme comes in, which is definitely in a lot of Porter stories.
yeah, and to to know other people.
Hmm.
I don't know. Um, how much her children knew of what all she had gone through, or the other people in the community. They
Hmm.
just saw this tough woman going on, and not knowing the burdens that one carries all the way to that last moment. Uh, so, and I think that that's part of that modernist
Hmm.
inquiry of the reader has to invent meaning or whatever. So I would think, in addition to those themes that we discussed throughout our conversation, I would say, just on a personal level, she's a character that through her, Porter's showing us, maybe, to be honest, with that pain,
Hmm.
and to have compassion on, and to know the pain that others carry.
Hmm.
I don't know. It was a tough question. I came up with this last minute. So I want your take on it, Alan.
Oh no, I'm sticking with self-delusion. It's because that's kind of a pattern, and actually Porter said that Flowering Judas was about self-delusion. That's what she was trying to convey in that story. I don't know if she ever commented on what she was trying to convey in this story, but this is Porter's probably most read and most popular story. So it seems to strike a chord with a lot of people in a lot of different ways. I don't know why I'm thinking of the singer Bette Midler.
Love
She
her.
said she said that there are some insults to our psyche that are so severe we never forget them, and that makes me think of the humiliation of the jilting by George, which she tries to persuade us that she's gotten over, but which the reader knows that she hasn't. So I was thinking, I was thinking of
Yeah.
it's an odd time to think of Bette Midler, but I was thinking of that. That's another theme, obviously, in it. And you could say the second jilting, it's just she weathers the first one, and the second one is just too much. She can't take it. So, like I said, in essence, as you say, she blows out her own light and sort of ends it before it's supposed to naturally end. So that's one thing she can't weather because it's just almost just almost too much. So, but I thank you for this really interesting discussion. Maybe if somebody, maybe there's a student out there that happens to stumble on my video, this will help them understand the story if they have to talk about it or write about it. I was curious. You said you taught this story. Was this the college in Tennessee? Is that right? Are you still teaching there or not?
I am actually retired, and
Okay.
I'm spending my free time joyfully writing and doing literary events. But yeah, Walter State Community College.
Okay, that's it.
This story is anthologized in
Still, yeah.
still it's
Hmm.
still in American literature.
Hmm.
Actually, it's in the um, and I took out my old uh, book that I textbook that I used to teach writing about literature. It was a course
Hmm.
called Composition 2, and it was
Hmm.
anthologized there. So it's considered a seminal story.
Hmm.
So yeah.
And probably it's a great way to teach the stream of consciousness technique and let students know what that is. As we talked about, it's a very modernist technique. And this short story may be one of the finest examples of it. Maybe that's why it's included also in all the textbooks, as you can talk about that particular technique and how it works in the story. And of course, as I was talking with Beth Alvarez about every college, every professor, they love symbols, and that's why I think Flowering Judas also has been widely anthologized, because you talk about that story endlessly, the Judas tree and what it
Mhm.
stands for. And like I said, the last paragraph. So colleges, they love that. So
Interesting.
maybe the story provides, but however, it is, like I said, an atheistic story. And the South is the most religious part of the country. So even though God is mentioned in the story, there's the bridegroom and sort of allusions to religion. Still at the end, we're left with there's nobody showing up for us at the end. At least not for Granny Weatherall. So
Right.
but I want to thank you once again for this great discussion, and just wanted to say also thank you for all your support. I mean, just so everybody out there knows, Danita wrote a fantastic blurb for my third book that was so great I had to cut it down because it's just too much praise. I couldn't handle it. I had to fit into a certain space. And then she also gave me a shout out on I believe on her Facebook page. I'm not on Facebook anymore, so I don't know what goes on Facebook. But I believe you said you had put me on your Facebook page, and also you gave me a shout out in your reading at City Lights and Silva, which I was privileged to attend. That really surprised me. I think you've probably been the most generous, because I've had blurbs from, let's see, Fred Chappell. And do you know the poet Tyler Knott Gregson? Are you familiar with his work?
Yes.
Yeah, he blurbed my second book, and that was a real honor. And then also Jennifer Reeser, who's a Louisiana poet, if you know her, she blurbed my first book. So I've had some great people, but you by far have been the most generous. You've given me more shout outs to more people than all those three combined. So I really appreciate it.
Well, I know great literature. I just
I
talked about a story. It
have
was
to
great.
ask you,
Alan, it was wonderful, your work, and so you're welcome. It was an honor for me.
thank you, thank you. Well, it was an honor for me to read you, and I was going to ask you. So we both written three books of poetry, so we have to have kind of a competition to see who writes their fourth book first. So are you working on your fourth book? I'm kind of sort of slowly working on mine.
I am slowly working on mine. I've farmed out some uh, poems to journals. Of a few have been published. Some I'm waiting to see if they will be. But yeah, and I have ideas about how it's all going to come together. I originally thought it would be sometime this year, but it's more than likely going to be sometime next year.
Well, poetry is hard for me. It took me years to write my first book, and I wrote my second book in about, I guess, 3 or 4 years, and my third book 3 or 4 years. So for me, it's the kind of thing that I write. It's tough. I think it's the hardest. Trying to write in traditional forms and still sound modern. And I'm trying to do what Robert Frost did. Not that I'm comparing myself to it, but someone called me like a second or third rate Robert Frost. And I took that as a great compliment because he's the greatest American poet, in my opinion. So being a second or third rate Robert Frost is still pretty good, right?
Right.
I'll,
I see the frost in you too.
I don't think I'll
Yeah.
ever attain those heights, but I consider that a compliment, just being mentioned in the same breath with him. So, well, I wish you all the luck in the world in your fourth book, and we'll be looking forward to it. I definitely will be looking forward to it, and And thank you for your time today, and we'll stay in touch, okay?
Yes, thank you, Alan. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.